A bell once tolled for the dead, until one day it didn't. In a village wrapped in fog and fear, silence became more than absence. It became a warning. Whispers spread like smoke, blame circled like vultures, and behind it all, something darker waited. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was on a wind-bitten evening in the January of '92 that I sat alone before the hearth at 221B Baker Street, the lamplight flickering gently against the mullioned panes, and the low rumble of London's carriages muffled beneath the steady drum of sleet on glass. Holmes had taken to his violin with a singular melancholy, drawing from it tones of such eerie delicacy that I fancied them the utterance of some ancient spectre adrift upon the Thames. The cases of late had been of little consequence, petty larcenies and jealous husbands, unworthy of Holmes's peculiar talents. Yet I have found that, in the quieter months of our shared lodgings, it is often then that some grim shadow from the provinces dares to trespass upon the stillness of our lives. Thus, it came to pass on that very night, a night when even the gaslight shivered and the kettle hissed with discontent, that a new client crossed our threshold, bearing with him a mystery of such singular strangeness and subtle horror that it stirred Holmes from his ennui and led us both to the village of Belmire, where silence itself had become a thing to fear. The knock came abrupt and purposeful, followed by the door swinging open upon a tall, gaunt figure wrapped in a threadbare travelling coat, his face pale, and his eyes wide with that unmistakable expression I had come to associate with men who have glimpsed something beyond their comprehension. Behind him, the hallway lamp cast a wan glow upon the rain slicking his shoulders, and for a moment he seemed more ghost than man. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, his voice quavering, though he strove for composure. Holmes set down his bow and motioned the man forward. "You have found him. Come nearer to the fire. Dr. Watson and I are at your disposal." The man took a seat hesitantly, clutching his sodden hat. "My name is Oswald Penbury, sir. I serve as sacristan to St. Etheldreda's Chapel in Belmire, Norfolk. I have come because—" Here he paused, swallowing hard. "Because the bell has fallen silent." "The bell?" I echoed, puzzled. "Yes, sir," he said, turning toward me with an earnest desperation. "The great silver funeral bell. For centuries it has tolled for the dead of Belmire, but now it will not ring. Not for love nor labour, and with its silence has come death." Holmes leaned forward, eyes glinting with sudden interest. "Go on, Mr. Penbury. Leave nothing out." Penbury's hands trembled slightly as he rubbed them before the flames, the skin raw from cold or anxiety. I could not say which. "The bell, sir, was cast in 1594, a marvel of its time, pure silver, alloyed with bronze. It rings only for funerals, never weddings, nor mass. They say its tone carries to the heavens themselves." He paused, and Holmes nodded for him to continue. "It tolled last a fortnight past, at the funeral of Reverend Amos Ketteridge, God rest him. A good man. He died in his sleep, sudden-like. Since then, the bell has refused to sound. We have inspected the rope, the clapper, even the gears in the belfry. No damage. Yet pull as we might, it yields nothing but silence." Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "And this silence has unsettled the village?" "Deeply, sir. Belmire is an old place. Superstitious. They whisper of curses. Some say the Reverend's soul was not at peace, that the bell senses it. You, however, do not subscribe to such beliefs." "I do not, Mr. Holmes. I believe something, or someone, is interfering. And now, another funeral approaches." I glanced at Holmes, who gave no outward sign, yet I knew at once his attention had fixed immovably upon the case. "The Reverend," Penbury continued, "was a man of kindness and learning. He came to Belmire 5 years ago, and quickly gained the respect of the villagers, though some bristled at his sermons on conscience and doubt. He believed faith must be lived, not merely professed. That stirred discomfort in certain quarters. He stared into the fire, as though searching the flames for clarity. He passed away 3 weeks ago on a Sunday morning. The maid found him seated at his desk, his head resting upon his hands, as if in prayer. The doctor claimed heart failure. Yet I found it strange. In what way? Holmes inquired softly. The bell, said Penbury, lowering his voice. It tolled for him as it should, but the very next day it failed, as though he had taken its voice with him. I felt a chill despite the warmth of the fire. There was something undeniably spectral in the image Penbury conjured. A bell that ceased its ancient duty after one final peal, as though in mourning not just for the man, but for some deeper truth now buried with him. There was a drowning, Penbury said after a pause. A young woman named Abigail Moore fell into the marsh pool near the old stone boundary, died before help could reach her. An accident? I asked. So the doctor says, but folk are whispering, saying the bell's silence is a sign that the ground itself resents our dead. He looked to Holmes, desperation plain on his weary face. They say the Reverend's daughter is cursed, that her father's teachings angered heaven. They've begun to call her the Angel of Death. Holmes's brows lifted ever so slightly. The daughter, Miss Lydia Ketteridge. She remains in the vicarage, refuses to leave, though many have urged her to go. The next funeral is to be held in 2 days' time for Miss Moore, if the bell fails again. Penbury left the sentence unfinished, but the implication hung heavily in the room. Fear had taken root in Belmire, and fear, I had learned, was often more perilous than any phantom. Holmes rose from his chair and turned toward the window, the sleet now easing into a thin mist that smeared the gaslight. Pack a valise, Watson, he said, his voice low and decisive. We leave for Belmire at dawn. Penbury exhaled in visible relief. Mr. Penbury, Holmes added, turning back, there is something unnatural in silence, particularly when it descends upon something made to speak. We shall see what truth lies behind your silver bell. And with that, our course was set toward one of the most sombre and strange cases ever to pass through Baker Street. It was beneath a slate-grey sky that we alighted from the Norfolk branch train at the modest platform of Belmire Halt, the surrounding moorland stretching outward in colourless solitude. A thick mist hung low upon the fields, clinging to hedgerows and soaking the edges of Holmes's greatcoat as we passed into the village proper. The streets were near empty, the thatched roofs slick with frost, and what few villagers we passed regarded us with muted suspicion. It was a place not merely quiet, but clenched with unease. A community watching itself from within. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent during our walk to the vicarage, save for a brief remark as we crossed a narrow lane that wound toward the church. You observe, Watson, he said, nodding toward the gatepost, that no one has set foot upon the path since yesterday at the earliest. Even the mourners avoid it. The church loomed ahead, partially obscured by low trees. Its bell tower pierced the fog like a warning finger against the sky. Mr. Penbury awaited us at the vicarage door and led us inside with an air of subdued urgency. The atmosphere had already begun to settle into Holmes's blood. I knew the signs, the quickening step, the slight narrowing of the eyes, and I felt a flicker of apprehension as we approached the place where death had recently dwelled and silence had taken up its post in the steeple above. Later that afternoon, with Penbury as our escort, we made our first visit to the chapel of St. Etheldreda. It was a simple structure of aged stone, girdled by leaning gravestones and ivy that curled like claws along its outer wall. Inside, the air was stale and cold, the dim light from the leaded windows casting long shadows across the pews. Watson though I am, I felt in that moment not unlike a trespasser upon sacred ground. For all the mundanity of our world, there are places that bear the weight of centuries, and the chapel was such a one. Above us, in the rafters, hung the great silver bell. It was smaller than I expected, its surface dulled with age, though an odd metallic sheen still clung to its rim. The bell rope dangled forlornly, coiled as though untouched for days. "Note the silence, Watson," Holmes murmured, not unkindly. "One forgets how much noise a place should make until it fails to do so." I had no answer to that. It seemed to me then that the bell did not merely fail to ring, it refused to, as though complicit in some unseen pact whose terms we had yet to uncover. Holmes requested that he be allowed to ascend the tower alone, though I remained below, listening keenly for the sounds of movement above. The rungs creaked under his tread, and I heard him pause near the upper belfry. After several minutes, his voice echoed faintly. "Watson, would you be so good as to send me up my magnifying glass?" I complied at once, and after a longer interval he reappeared, descending slowly with his expression unreadable. "Well?" I asked. "The bell is intact," he said, brushing dust from his sleeves. "The clapper shows no sign of fracture or fatigue. The pulley is smooth, the rope strong." "Then what?" "However," he interrupted gently, "there are faint abrasions about the rope's base. Someone has tampered with it, but not crudely, and the bell's inner lip bears residue, thin, silvery flakes, and a pale grey dust unlike the usual corrosion one might expect." I blinked. "You suspect sabotage, then?" "I suspect nothing yet," Holmes replied. "I merely observe anomalies, but it is a curious dust, slightly crystalline, almost inert to touch." He held up a glass vial in which a trace amount shimmered faintly. "It will require further analysis, of course, but we may safely say the bell did not fall silent of its own volition." He said no more for some time, and as we stepped back into the fading light of day, I could not shake the impression that the silver bell had been muffled by design, its voice stolen not by age, but by an unseen hand. That evening, we were introduced to Miss Lydia Ketteridge, the daughter of the late Reverend, in the vicarage parlour. She stood as though sculpted from stillness, tall, composed, and dressed in mourning black. Her eyes were steady, but within them I perceived a quiet exhaustion that bespoke long nights and heavier burdens than propriety would allow her to voice. "I am grateful for your coming, Mr. Holmes," she said, in a voice low but firm. "Though I fear you will find only shadows here, and little else." Holmes inclined his head. "Sometimes, Miss Ketteridge, it is in the shadows that truth finds refuge." She regarded him for a moment, then glanced toward the chapel, visible through the frosted pane. "The villagers believe I bring misfortune, that my father's spirit resents the silence of the bell. They whisper at my back and avoid my doorstep. And you," I asked gently, "do you believe the bell has been silenced for supernatural cause?" A flicker crossed her face, of sorrow, not superstition. "No, Doctor. I believe my father knew something that others wished forgotten." Holmes's eyes brightened, though his tone remained mild. "And do you suspect whom?" She looked away. "I suspect I am being watched. That is all." As we departed, Holmes turned to me and said quite softly, "There is intelligence there, Watson. And pain. Mark both well. They may prove more revealing than fingerprints." Our next call was upon Mr. Jared Blount, the betrothed of poor Miss Abigail Moore, whose untimely death had only fanned the flames of dread that clung to Belmire like the winter fog. He received us at the public house, his face drawn and temper brittle, his fingers stained with tobacco and ink. "She slipped, that's all," he muttered, refusing Holmes's gaze. "The marsh is treacherous this time of year." "You found the body?" Holmes asked gently. "Number." The grocer's lad did. I'd gone out walking. And where might that walk have taken you? Nowhere worth noting, Blount snapped, and then more quietly, I needed air. That's not a crime. There was a peculiar tension in his posture, not merely grief, but evasion. His words lacked the specificity of the innocent, and I noted Holmes's slight shift in stance, the signal, unmistakable to me now, that he had scented something askew. I suppose you think I pushed her, Blount said, a sneer forming. Go ask Lydia. She's the one they all fear. We left him shortly after, but I could not rid myself of the impression that Mr. Blount knew far more of Abigail Moore's death than he would admit, perhaps even to himself. We found Dr. Aldous Linton seated behind a disordered desk in his surgery, sorting through a tray of vials with mechanical indifference. A tall, heavy-set man with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that seemed to measure rather than observe, he greeted us with a brisk nod, but no invitation to sit. Both natural deaths, he said flatly, before Holmes had uttered more than a greeting. Ketteridge's heart gave out. The girl drowned. No mystery to it, despite what the local gossips imagine. And yet you signed no post-mortem on either, Holmes noted. Nor was one required, Linton replied curtly. Reverend Ketteridge had a weak heart. As for the girl, she struck her head on a submerged stone. Blount may be moody, but he's no murderer. You seem quite certain, I said. Linton's gaze slid across to me. Certainty is the physician's burden, Doctor. There was a dryness to his voice that unsettled me, and Holmes, who had taken no notes, offered only a quiet thank you before we departed. As we stepped outside, Holmes murmured, A man too quick to close a case may have more than truth to conceal. His desk was disorderly, but his hands were not. In the days that followed, Holmes and I made several circuits of the village, and I began to appreciate the full breadth of fear that gripped Belmire. Though few would speak to us directly, I caught murmurs in shop queues and whispers through barely cracked doors. They did not speak of murder, but of curses, of wronged spirits, of the dead whose souls could not rest because the bell remained silent. It was Miss Lydia Ketteridge who bore the weight of their terror. Children crossed the street to avoid her shadow, and grown men averted their eyes as she passed. Once, I witnessed a crude sigil chalked upon her gatepost, an old symbol meant to ward against evil. She is marked, I heard one woman hiss behind her kerchief. Since her father died, death follows her like smoke. That afternoon, I voiced my concern to Holmes. The villagers are near to madness. If something more should occur, another death, even a false alarm, there may be violence. Holmes, ever calm, replied, That is why we must move quickly. Fear thrives in silence, Watson, and someone has worked diligently to ensure both prevail here. He glanced toward the chapel tower, its bell rope still unmoved. When sound is stripped away, men begin to hear only their own dread. Our final inquiry that week led us back to the late Reverend Ketteridge's study. Miss Lydia granted us access with a resigned nod, though she did not join us. The room was modestly furnished, lined with shelves of well-thumbed theological texts and papers in neat order, save one conspicuous absence. The parish ledger is gone, Holmes said at once. He traced a pale rectangle of dust on the desk's corner with one long finger. Have you asked Miss Ketteridge about it? I inquired. Not yet. She has the look of one who speaks only when ready, and we are not yet owed her truths. Holmes moved to the Reverend's writing cabinet and ran his hand across its polished surface. One drawer resisted his pull. He examined its keyhole, then reached into his coat and produced a thin piece of steel. With delicate precision, he coaxed the drawer open. Inside lay an array of correspondence, a dried violet pressed within a devotional, and a folded paper marked only with a blot of red sealing wax, unbroken. Holmes made no move to open it. "Curious," he said softly. "The Reverend appears to have been preparing to send a letter of grave importance, one he never delivered." He examined the inner lining of the drawer and tapped its rear panel. A slight echo answered. "A false back, Watson, but tampered with recently." We made no further move that evening. Holmes merely relocked the drawer and replaced everything as it was. "That ledger, and what once lay in that false compartment," he said as we departed, "form the pivot upon which this entire mystery turns. Someone has erased something, and they have done it with care. That level of effort is not spent on irrelevance. We must consider who had both access and motive." "And what of the letter?" Holmes gave a rare sigh. "It may be the only voice left in Belmire willing to speak the truth, if only we might persuade it." It was 2 days later, in the quiet dusk of the vicarage study, that Holmes knelt before the hearth and withdrew from the ashes a crumpled sheet, scorched and brittle at the edges. His fingers, always so deft, handled it with reverence, as though afraid it might disintegrate in the act of observation. "I suspected something was missing," he murmured, "but only now do I understand what was meant to be hidden." The page bore the unmistakable remains of a ledger. Lines of clerical handwriting, precise in form, yet oddly distorted near the bottom. Among the half-burnt entries were dates, sums of money, and a curious annotation scrawled in a different hand altogether. Atonement demanded. Holmes retrieved several more fragments, some blackened beyond recognition, others bearing partial phrases. 5th of November, confession, and hauntingly, a third name, to be accounted. "A third name?" I said. "Do you suppose he meant another victim?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He placed the fragments in a satchel and sat back upon his heels. "Someone attempted to destroy this record thoroughly, but they lacked either time or nerve," he said. "The Reverend may have known of something, perhaps of someone, and sought to leave a record of it before death silenced him." "Then the fire was set by the killer?" "Not necessarily," he replied. "We must not conflate suspicion with certainty. It may have been Miss Kettridge herself, seeking to protect her father's name, or even Pembury, should he have discovered something unseemly. But I do believe this fire was set after the Reverend's death. That makes it, at the very least, deliberate." There was a moment of quiet between us before Holmes added softly, "Atonement and a third name. These are not the words of chance. They are the scaffold of guilt." That night, as we sat by the fire in our lodging at the Belmire Inn, Holmes spread the fragments of parchment across the table like a general mapping a battlefield. He had arranged the legible phrases in a careful sequence, frowning over them as if listening for meaning in the silence between words. "The Reverend was no fool," Holmes said at last. "He altered his script near the end. Note the uneven slant here and the tremor in the hand. I would wager these lines were written not in contemplation, but in haste, perhaps fear." He tapped one piece gently. "This mention of atonement is not doctrinal. It is personal. He believed someone had wronged another gravely, perhaps irreparably, and sought to correct it." "And the third name?" I asked. He looked up. "It suggests that there are 3 persons involved in some clandestine affair. 2, we might surmise, have already met their end. The third remains." "You mean to say the deaths of the Reverend and Miss Moore may not be isolated events at all," Holmes finished for me, "but stages in a sequence. That sequence now approaches its culmination." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "We must discover what the Reverend knew, and who might have killed to suppress it." The following morning brought with it a horror so profound that it scattered all semblance of calm from the village of Belmire. It was Pembury who found the body. His cry echoed across the chapel yard, and within moments a crowd had gathered at the threshold of the bell tower. Holmes and I were not long in arriving, though I must admit to a sense of dread that seized me as we ascended those stone steps. There, in the narrow space beneath the great bell, lay the lifeless form of Davy Spriggs, the mute bell ringer. His body was curled as if in prayer, though there was no peace in his expression. His mouth was open, eyes wide, the flesh of his hands torn and blackened, both wrists bearing rope burns so deep the bone itself showed in places. The bell rope lay beside him, its frayed end clutched in his ruined fingers. "Dear God," I whispered, stepping back instinctively. Holmes crouched beside the corpse, his face grim but composed. He tried to sound the bell, he said, and someone made certain he would never succeed. There was no sign of a struggle, no foreign footprints upon the tower stairs. If foul play had been involved, and Holmes clearly believed it had been conducted with calculated silence. By noon, the story had spread through the village like fire on dry straw, and with it came fear, greater than any we had yet seen. "They say the bell took him," one woman cried. "No," muttered an old man at her elbow. "The angel of death did." It was then I realized that the town had begun to fracture, not from the presence of death, but from the absence of reason. And from the bell tower above us, the silence continued to reign. It would be difficult to overstate the effect Spriggs's death had upon Belmire. The villagers, once merely wary, now moved in open fear. Doors were barred by daylight, curtains drawn even at noon. Children were kept indoors, and in the square, prayer circles gathered beneath a sky grey with foreboding. Yet no prayer seemed aimed at comfort. Rather they were pleas, some for mercy, others for protection. The brunt of the hysteria, as before, fell upon Miss Lydia Ketteridge. Accusations came not from children now, but from elders, whispers in the post office, muttered curses in the market. That evening, someone shattered a lantern outside the vicarage gate and left a crude effigy, its face painted black and a circle drawn in salt around its feet. "I can no longer walk freely in my own home," she said to me when I brought word of it. Her voice did not tremble, but her hands were clenched white upon her sleeves. Holmes paced slowly behind her. "And yet," he said, "you remain." "There is nowhere else," she replied. That night, I asked Holmes whether she might be in danger. "She already is," he said, not looking up. "But not from villagers." "Then from whom?" He paused, then said only, "The third name." By the following morning, the situation in Belmire had turned from uneasy to perilous. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than was my wont, for the village, once merely superstitious, had taken on the air of a powder keg, needing only the faintest spark to ignite. And I feared that spark might bear the name Lydia Ketteridge. Holmes had become quieter with each passing hour, his lean form often seen pacing near the chapel, or seated in silence, fingertips pressed together, eyes half-lidded as though seeing something none of us could. He had sent no further telegrams, made no bold deductions, only observed. That afternoon, I took it upon myself to urge him toward action. "Holmes, we cannot stand by. If something befalls Miss Ketteridge, it will not be the fault of ignorance, but of inaction." To my surprise, Holmes responded not with reproof, but with the faintest of nods. "You are quite right, Watson," he said, his voice low. "But our enemy does not strike in haste. He is careful, methodical. His pattern is that of a man who knows precisely how long fear can be allowed to simmer before he acts again." He stood abruptly. "We must know who benefits by silence, and we must do so before the bell is tolled again. This time, perhaps, for Miss Ketteridge herself." Holmes's resolve, once roused, was as relentless as a river thawing in spring. That very day, we commenced a quiet but thorough inquiry, beginning with the question so often dismissed, yet invariably revealing: who stands to gain? We discovered that the Reverend, though by no means wealthy, had recently received word of a modest inheritance, ancestral property from a distant cousin, deceased in Gloucestershire. According to the solicitor's correspondence, the estate was to pass solely to Miss Lydia, but its disclosure had only arrived days before her father's sudden death. Curious, Holmes remarked, not in its content, but in its timing. More intriguing still were the parish's maintenance accounts, which Penbury, once convinced of Holmes's integrity, allowed us to examine. They contained routine entries until the month prior to the Reverend's death, where a large, unexplained outlay appeared under the entry, "Tower repairs." There was no such repair, Penbury assured us. "Then someone has taken liberties," Holmes said. "And liberties, Watson, always demand payment." That payment, we learned, may have been made in minerals rather than coin. At the edge of the village stood a disused quarry, abandoned for decades, but recently, according to a local shepherd, visited under cover of darkness. Holmes took particular interest in the shepherd's description of a cart bearing no visible load, yet leaving faint, metallic residue on the roadside. "Belmire," he mused aloud, "sits upon earth not wholly indifferent to profit. Someone has found reason to disturb it." We spent that evening examining chemical catalogues and mineral registries. Holmes lingered over one entry in particular, a resinous compound used in soundproofing industrial machinery, known to leave behind a pale dust when applied improperly. It matched precisely what he had scraped from the silver bell. "The motive is no longer merely concealment," Holmes concluded. "It is advantage. The question remains: what secret is worth such silence?" The path to revelation is seldom a straight one. With suspicion narrowed but proof still elusive, Holmes departed early the following morning under pretense of collecting weather data from the marshlands. I knew better than to press him. When Holmes grew vague, it was invariably the prelude to clarity. He returned after nightfall, his boots muddied and his coat damp from the fog, but his eyes, those piercing, calculating eyes, were alight with a subdued intensity. "Well?" I asked. He sat at the table and withdrew a small corked vial from his coat. It contained a greyish powder, so fine it clung to the glass like ash. "From Dr. Linton's dispensary," Holmes said simply. "You entered uninvited?" "Let us call it unofficially welcomed. His back room was not locked, merely ill-kept. I found the vial beneath a false bottom in a drawer labelled for morphine distillates." He examined the contents in the lamplight. "It is the same compound I found on the bell. And look here." He uncorked the bottle and tapped a few grains onto a scrap of cloth. Within seconds, they clumped into a sticky residue. Moisture activated, applied subtly, it would coat the clapper with a film sufficient to muffle any strike. "And this substance?" I asked. "An industrial resin used to suppress vibration. Rarely found in a physician's possession, unless, of course, the physician has interests beyond healing." "You believe Linton silenced the bell?" "I believe he silenced more than that." He retrieved from his pocket a folded document, tattered and smudged with soot. A forged certificate, buried in Linton's effects. It appears the good doctor was never licensed in London. He failed his qualifications, then vanished for 3 years before resurfacing here under a new name. The Reverend, I suspect, discovered the truth. I sat back, struck by the implication. Then Ketteridge was silenced before he could expose him. Miss Moore perhaps knew something as well. Holmes inclined his head, and poor Davy Spriggs likely saw him tampering in the bell tower, one by one, Watson. But the pattern is too careful now to continue unchecked. We must act swiftly. The next tolling of that bell must not mark another grave. On the morning following his return from the clandestine visit to Dr. Linton's surgery, Holmes summoned Mr. Penbury and Miss Ketteridge to the vicarage parlour and made his announcement in that composed, almost indifferent tone I had come to associate with the certainty of action. "I intend," said he, "to repair the bell in time for the funeral of Mr. Spriggs tomorrow at dusk." A pause met his declaration. Penbury looked positively stricken. "But, sir, the mechanism is quite recoverable," Holmes replied, "though I must insist that no one else enter the belfry until the service is concluded." Miss Ketteridge regarded him silently, her eyes searching. "And the bell will ring?" Holmes met her gaze. "It will." News of Holmes's intentions spread through Belmire with astonishing swiftness. By midday, murmurs had reached every shopfront and fireside that the detective from London would make the bell sound again, and that the spell might be broken at last. As we prepared for the task ahead, I questioned Holmes on the wisdom of drawing so much attention. "It is precisely what I intend," he said. "A trap, Watson, is of no use unless the prey knows where to step." He said nothing more, but I noticed his violin case, usually containing his Stradivarius, now held something heavier and wrapped in cloth. When I raised an eyebrow, he merely offered one of his rare smiles. "There is more than one way to tune a bell, my dear Watson." The following evening brought with it a stillness that seemed almost orchestrated, not the hush of peace, but that of breath held in anticipation. The air had turned sharper with the setting sun, and by the hour of the funeral, a thick mist had rolled in from the moors, hemming the village inn with its damp veil. Holmes had vanished into the chapel well before sunset, offering no more than a nod to me as he disappeared behind the heavy door. I remained outside, among the gathering crowd. They came slowly at first, villagers in mourning black, faces pale and drawn, but before long, nearly the whole of Belmire had assembled on the chapel green. Not all came to grieve Spriggs, I think, but rather to witness what had become a moment of reckoning. Miss Ketteridge stood apart, her face unreadable. Penbury muttered prayers to himself, fingers clenching and unclenching at his sides. As the hour approached, I heard one voice among the villagers whisper, "If the bell does not ring, there'll be no saving her." It was then I understood Holmes's urgency, not only to catch a murderer, but to forestall the madness into which fear might plunge an entire community. Holmes had insisted upon solitude in the tower, and his wishes were honoured, though not without protest. I had offered to assist, but he declined with a quiet, "The bell is not the only thing being tested." So it was that I stood below, listening to the muffled groans of old wood and rope as he moved through the belfry above. From time to time I heard faint tapping, the slide of metal, the scrape of something against stone. I imagined him there, in that narrow chamber, surrounded by dust and shadows, threading his trap as deftly as any spider. Nearly an hour passed in this fashion. The funeral procession, modest and grim, arrived in silence. The coffin, small and simply adorned, was carried by 4 men in solemn duty. The service began shortly thereafter, led by Penbury in trembling voice. Holmes did not emerge. I stole a glance upward and noted that the rope had been freshly fastened. No visible fray now hung from its length, and the bell's clapper, which had seemed so dull and listless, now glinted faintly in the dusk. The villagers stirred, sensing the weight of the moment, yet Holmes remained above, out of sight, as though waiting for the precise instant when silence itself would be most brittle, most vulnerable. At precisely the moment the final blessing was uttered, there came a sound unlike any we had heard in weeks, a deep, resonant toll that rolled across the chapel grounds, like thunder harnessed and made holy. The bell rang, not once, but thrice, each strike fuller than the last, as though it had drawn breath from the earth itself. A collective gasp passed through the crowd. Penbury fell to his knees. Miss Kettridge's lips parted but formed no words. For a heartbeat, all stood still. Then, from within the chapel, a cry rang out. It was not the voice of mourning. It was a sound sharp with desperation, the bark of someone caught in the act. Holmes emerged from the tower a moment later, his strides swift and precise. He made no statement, merely gestured to Penbury and myself. We rushed inside to find Doctor Linton kneeling upon the chapel floor, attempting, futilely, to pry loose a flagstone. Beside him lay a short iron tool, and from the partially unearthed hollow rose the edge of a box, iron-bound, ancient, and sealed with a rusted clasp. The trap had closed, and in that moment I saw not merely guilt in Linton's face, but panic, the panic of a man who had misjudged silence as safety, and the tolling of a bell as something he could forever prevent. The third toll had scarcely faded when a shrill cry, half gasp, half shout, pierced the chapel's gloom. The mourners froze. A second later, a murmur rippled through the crowd like a wind through reeds. "Inside!" someone cried. "There's someone inside!" I was already moving before the words had finished. Holmes's expression, calm though alert, told me this had not merely been expected, it had been invited. We entered the nave to find a chaotic scene, pews disturbed, the altar cloth askew, and near the chancel, a patch of upturned flagstones revealing disturbed earth beneath. At its centre crouched Dr. Linton, no longer the composed country physician, but a man unravelled. His hands were covered in dirt, a crowbar lay beside him, and beside that, the half-exhumed shape of an iron-bound box, its surface dented from futile blows. Holmes appeared at my shoulder. "Rather an odd time for renovations, Doctor." Linton whirled, eyes wild. "It's mine. No one had the right. He was going to—" He said no more, for two of the villagers, now emboldened by the reappearance of the bell's voice, stepped forward and restrained him without resistance. The chapel fell quiet again, but the silence, this time, no longer held sway. Linton was led to the vestry, still trembling, and placed under the watch of Penbury and the village constable. It was there, amid the cracked plaster and fading hymnals, that Holmes laid bare the matter with his usual cool authority. "The pattern," he began, "was apparent, though its execution was most clever. A series of misfortunes cloaked as natural deaths. But behind them, a singular purpose, concealment." He gestured toward the iron box, now fully unearthed, and open to reveal several crumbling documents, among them an unsigned letter bearing the Reverend's seal. Reverend Kettridge discovered Linton's secret, not merely his forged credentials, which I confirmed through correspondence with the medical register in London, but also his involvement in a covert trade of restricted chemical substances, morphine among them, and a rare industrial resin that left unmistakable residue. He turned to Linton. "You feared exposure. The Reverend would not be bribed nor persuaded, and so, in calculated silence, you arranged for his death, an untraceable dose, administered under the guise of kindness, a heart attack, conveniently diagnosed by the one man never questioned." Linton said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the floor. "But death leaves traces," Holmes continued, "and you are no longer careful. Miss Moore found your ledger, perhaps by accident. She confronted you, and you silenced her as well." The villagers stared at Linton with a mix of horror and disbelief. "And Spriggs?" I asked. Holmes's jaw tightened. "He witnessed Linton tampering with the bell. It had to be silenced to drive the village into fear. Fear directed not at the killer, but at Miss Kettridge. A scapegoat forged from grief." At last, Linton raised his eyes, not pleading, but resigned. He spoke but 4 words. He should have stayed silent. It was, I thought, the most damning confession of all. We gathered that evening in the vicarage study, the fire burning low and the iron box placed upon the desk before us. Holmes sat back in his chair, fingertips together, and began the final explanation with the calm of a man who had long since solved the puzzle in his mind and now merely translated it for others. The silencing of the bell was not a miracle, nor a malfunction, but a matter of precise chemistry. The compound applied to the clapper, resinous, grey, moisture reactive, was designed to create a thin layer that dampened all vibration. It rendered the bell mute, not broken, and it was reversible. He uncorked the vial retrieved from Linton's surgery. This resin is rarely found in rural practice, but it is used in mechanical soundproofing, exactly the sort that might be known to someone with industrial connections or illicit supplies. A poor disguise for a criminal's conscience, but a fine one for his bell. Holmes turned the Reverend's letter toward us. Though damaged, it revealed that Ketteridge had indeed uncovered Linton's past. His failure in medical school, his disappearance, and re-emergence under a false name. He had written a plea for disclosure before the Lord, but had hesitated to act, likely out of concern for the village's peace. Yet he planned to speak, Holmes said. The hidden letter, the locked drawer, it shows intention, and intention, to a man like Linton, is threat enough. And the murders followed in succession, I added quietly, each one linked to the truth. Precisely, Holmes said. But more cunning still was the orchestration of fear. By silencing the bell, Linton cast a pall over Belmire. He knew the villagers' minds would turn to superstition. He used their dread to turn suspicion against an innocent woman, and in doing so, bought himself time to destroy what remained. He leaned back. It was not silence alone that cloaked his crimes, but the meaning he allowed others to assign to it. A long moment passed. Then Holmes added, "Sound may be muffled by science, Watson, but fear is a matter of faith." Dr. Linton was removed under police escort the following day, offering no resistance and few words. His trial, held weeks later in Norwich, was swift and certain. The forged documents, the residue, the unsealed letter, all converged into a noose from which no rhetoric could deliver him. Miss Ketteridge remained in Belmire, though I know not whether out of duty or defiance. The villagers, contrite in the wake of revelation, extended quiet amends. Yet I suspected she had grown beyond the reach of their apologies. The silver bell was rung again for Spriggs, this time without dread. Its tone, clear and solemn, marked not only the end of a life, but the return of order. On our journey home, Holmes smoked in silence until at last he spoke. There is no sound more feared than silence when it once signalled truth. The bell tolled for the dead, yes, but its silence condemned the living. I could find no answer to that, and so we rode on, the countryside passing like smoke, the mystery behind us, solved but not forgotten. It was several days later, after the necessary formalities in Belmire had been concluded, that Holmes and I found ourselves once more at Baker Street. The fire was lit, the gas lamp steady, and the city's din once again provided the familiar background to our return from darker climes. Holmes sat in his usual chair, pipe in hand, his gaze turned to the smoke curling toward the ceiling, as though it might yet yield fresh patterns to decipher. I had remained quiet for some time, reluctant to intrude upon his thoughts, but he at last stirred and turned toward me. "You look as though you're waiting for the final chapter, Watson," he said, not unkindly. "Would it be so wrong?" I asked. The case was unlike any we've faced, quiet, cruel, and steeped in dread. I confess it still troubles me. He nodded once. As well it should, but the threads have all been drawn in. Allow me to retrace them, if only to lay your conscience to rest. And so he began, not as a man recounting a triumph, but as one delivering the final strokes to a portrait long imagined, now revealed in full beneath the dust of silence. The first and most telling clue, Holmes began, was the bell itself. A mechanism so ancient, so constant, and yet so suddenly mute, it invited scrutiny. And what did I find? A residue, pale, crystalline, and oddly resistant to abrasion. He gestured toward a specimen slide resting on the table. It is a variant of silicate resin used in industrial settings, more often to dampen sound in engine housings or heavy machinery. Not a substance one would expect to find in a chapel, unless deliberately introduced. He leaned forward slightly. The bell's silence, Watson, was not the result of mechanical failure, but of deliberate muting. A thin layer of this resin applied to the clapper rendered each strike inaudible. A simple trick, but highly effective when timed with a death. I nodded. And you confirmed its match in Dr. Linton's possession. Indeed. The same compound was found, though poorly concealed, in a vial beneath the false drawer of his surgery. It had been repackaged, but its properties were unmistakable. A perfect match, chemically and tactically. And so the bell fell silent, not by divine omen, but by human interference. Holmes's brow lifted. Precisely. And it was that silence, weaponized so subtly, that first betrayed the hand behind the crime. Holmes turned next to the charred fragments we had salvaged from the fireplace in the vicarage study. They now lay spread upon a sheet of black felt, the faint traces of ink visible only under a magnifying lens. The ledger, as you recall, had been partially destroyed, but not with sufficient care. The entries were plain enough, records of donations, names, dates, but the final pages bore signs of haste, a tremor in the pen stroke, and a shift in phrasing, a departure from the cleric's usual precision. Holmes indicated a specific scrap. Atonement demanded, a third name to be accounted. These are the words of a man burdened with knowledge he did not wish to keep. He had learned of Linton's forgery, his false identity, his unearned medical post, and perhaps more. You believe the Reverend intended to expose him? Undoubtedly, Holmes replied. But he hesitated. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps a misguided belief in redemption. Still, he documented his findings. He tapped another piece. The handwriting here, however, is not the Reverend's. It is Linton's attempt to mimic it. A poor attempt, marred by stress and the wrong ink. I blinked. He forged the confession? No, Holmes said quietly. He forged the absence of it. And that is, in its own way, the greater crime. What truly elevated Linton's scheme, Holmes said, was not the method, but the manipulation. He understood that fear, when directed, is more potent than any accusation. He silenced the bell, I said slowly, to awaken old fears. Holmes nodded. Precisely. The villagers, already steeped in superstition, needed only the faintest suggestion of the unnatural, a bell that would not ring at death. To them, it was no mechanical failure. It was judgment. And Lydia? I asked. She became the natural target, Holmes replied. The daughter of a man who had challenged traditional doctrine, a figure already set apart. Her composure, her isolation, they read it as guilt. Linton needed only to nudge them. He exhaled. By orchestrating silence and guiding fear, he bought himself both time and protection. A village in hysteria is far less likely to question a familiar face, and more likely to blame an unfamiliar one. Holmes leaned back. In Belmire, silence became a weapon, and he wielded it masterfully until the bell tolled again. I confess that, at the time, I had not fully understood Holmes's insistence upon ascending the bell tower alone. It was only later, in the warmth of Baker Street, that he revealed the extent of his secret testing. The residue on the clapper, he explained, was present but faint. I applied a minute solvent compound to its surface, a combination of heat and moisture that would, if I was correct, dissolve the resin in time for the funeral. And it did. Precisely on cue, Holmes said, with a trace of satisfaction. But the bell itself was only one half of the test. The more crucial experiment was behavioural. He removed a pocketbook and opened it to a series of notations, times, actions, observed responses. I monitored the reactions of each suspect to the idea of the bell being repaired. Linton alone showed visible discomfort. Not dismay, not fear, but calculation. His eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but in anticipation. You baited him. I invited him to act, Holmes said, to strike while he believed the spell was still intact. He closed the notebook. When silence is the shield, Watson, sound becomes the sword. I merely handed him the rope. In the days that followed Linton's arrest, Belmire began, slowly, to return to itself. The chapel bell rang again, softly at first, then more surely, as if reminded of its purpose. The villagers, chastened and quiet, resumed their routines with the solemnity that comes only after communal shame. Miss Lydia Ketteridge did not leave, as some had expected. Instead, she remained in the vicarage, resumed her father's correspondence with the church trustees, and took it upon herself to oversee the cleaning of the chapel. When I remarked upon her decision, she answered only, "Someone must stay." And I have known silence enough. Holmes, in a gesture I found both surprising and rather moving, arranged for a new bell cord to be commissioned, this time reinforced with fine steel wire. As resistant to wear as to tampering, he said, and symbolic, I hope, of something stronger left behind. Penbury, once ashen with guilt and anxiety, spoke at Spriggs's memorial with a clarity I had not before seen in him. The villagers listened. It would take time, of course. Wounds such as these do not heal at the sound of a bell alone. But I believe, as Holmes did, that truth had spoken, and that for once it had been heard. That evening, as the case lay fully behind us, I found Holmes in a contemplative mood, his gaze fixed upon the dying embers of our fire. "I've been thinking," he said at last, "of how little we consider silence until it speaks." I said nothing, knowing he would continue in his own rhythm. There are silences of comfort, of reverence, even of awe. But the most dangerous are those filled with implication, those we leave unchallenged because we fear what lies beneath. "The silence of the bell," I murmured. He nodded. It was not merely absence. It was presence masked, truth denied by means most elegant. Linton understood that well. He knew that to silence a sound long associated with death is to raise more fear than any sound could inspire. And yet, I said, it was the return of that sound that undid him. "A poetic symmetry," Holmes replied, "though I find little pleasure in such ironies." He stood and crossed to the window. The street outside was quiet, the lamplight steady. "There is no confession quite so loud as silence, Watson," he said, "but only to the ear that knows how to listen." And with that, he fell into his chair, pipe in hand, and spoke no more. As we sat once more in the comfort of Baker Street, I watched Holmes's gaze drift from the dying fire to the silence beyond the window. He had spoken little since returning from Belmire, and when he did, it was not to gloat, but to muse. "It is curious, Watson," he said at last, "how men often fear what they cannot hear more than what they plainly see. The bell did not accuse, yet its silence condemned." "You mean Linton's plan?" I asked. "I mean the world's fondness for letting absence speak on its behalf," he replied. "Silence becomes an accomplice when no one dares to challenge it. And yet once broken, once truth dares to make a sound, it rings louder than any lie. What do you think was the criminal's greatest mistake? tampering with the bell, underestimating the villagers, or trusting silence to hide the truth? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And while you're here, be sure to subscribe for more mysteries that challenge the mind and stir the soul. And don't forget to share this story with those who love the quiet thrill of a classic case. The next adventure awaits.